The first thing I remember is my father whispering like a thief in his own garden. It was late, cold enough that the grass felt damp through my shoes. I had stepped outside because the house smelled like boiled vegetables and medicine, and honestly, it was making my stomach turn. Then I heard him. Richard Carter. My father. He was on the phone, pacing slowly near the hedge like he didn't want the house to hear him. At this rate, he said quietly, he won't make it to winter. I froze. For a second, I actually thought he was talking about someone else. A client? A business partner? Anyone. Then he said the name. Dad's condition is worse than we expected. My chest tightened. I swear my hands went numb right there. The voice on the phone was Nathan, my brother. I couldn't hear him clearly, just the low buzz of his reply. Dad kept walking. Just make sure your mother keeps the dosage small, he said. We can't risk another hospital visit. Dosage. That word stuck in my head like a nail. There was a faint smell of cigarette smoke drifting over the hedge from the neighbor's yard. I remember that stupid detail so clearly. Funny what your brain decides to hold on to. I leaned closer to the corner of the house. Dad lowered his voice even more. Once the board meeting happens next month, he said, everything becomes permanent. Permanent. The call ended a minute later. He slipped the phone into his pocket and walked back inside like nothing had happened. I stayed in the dark a little longer, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. I hadn't. Anyway, I should probably explain how I ended up standing in that garden in the first place. My name is Adeline Carter. I am 31 years old, and 2 days before that phone call, I was still in Zurich pretending my family was normal. Most mornings, the office smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the machine near the elevators. I remember that detail clearly because everything else about that week has blurred together. My phone rang while I was reviewing a logistics contract. Boston number. I almost ignored it. Adeline, my mother said when I answered. Margaret Carter rarely called unless something was wrong. What happened, I asked. There was a small pause on the line. It's your grandfather. Those 3 words were enough to make my chest tighten. What about him? He had a stroke. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the spreadsheets on my screen. How bad is it the doctors say he'll recover? She said quickly. But your father and Nathan are managing the company for now. Things are complicated. Complicated. That word again. Why are you calling me? I asked. Another pause. He keeps asking for you. That surprised me more than the stroke itself. My grandfather was the only person in that house who ever treated me like I mattered. You should come home, she said quietly. Is he conscious? Sometimes. I closed the contract file and looked out the office window at the gray Zurich sky. An hour later, I booked a flight to Boston. Looking back, that was the moment everything began to change. By the time I landed in Boston, my father had already taken control of everything. Nathan told me that before I even reached the front door. He was waiting in the driveway when the taxi pulled away, leaning against the railing like he had been expecting me. Long flight, he asked. Where's Grandpa inside? Resting. The house smelled faintly of disinfectant and something overcooked in the kitchen. It was the kind of smell that settles into walls after too many long days of illness. I started toward the door, but Nathan caught my arm. Adeline, he said quietly, before you go in there, just understand things have changed. I pulled my arm back. What does that mean? It means Dad and I are handling Whitaker Holdings for now. Handling, I repeated. Grandpa signed temporary authority papers after the stroke. Nathan said, the board needed someone in charge. Temporary. I studied his face for a moment. You always wanted this, I said. Nathan didn't deny it. Inside, my father was standing near the kitchen counter. Richard Carter gave me a quick nod. Nothing more. You made it, he said. Where is he upstairs? Sleeping. How bad is it? He's weak, my father replied. The doctors say confusion is normal after a stroke. Nathan stepped in behind me. We've got it under control. That was the moment I understood something. They hadn't asked me to come home because they needed family. They asked because they needed someone to stay upstairs, while they ran everything downstairs. The first time I saw my grandfather after the stroke, I almost didn't recognize him. The bedroom smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, the kind of sharp, clinical scent that lingers long after hospitals leave a place. He lay in bed with his eyes closed, breathing slowly beneath a thin blanket. This was Theodore Whitaker, the man who built Whitaker Holdings from a small trucking company into a business worth hundreds of millions. Now he looked fragile, smaller than I remembered. I stepped closer to the bed. Grandpa. His eyelids lifted slowly. For a moment, his gaze drifted past me, unfocused. Then he blinked again. "Adeline," he whispered. I sat beside him and took his hand. "Yeah, it's me." His fingers tightened weakly around mine. "You came back." "Of course I did." "They said you were busy," he murmured. I gave a small smile. "They say a lot of things." He looked at me for another second before exhaustion pulled his eyes closed again. The door opened quietly behind me. My mother stepped inside carrying a tray. "Don't wake him too long," Margaret Carter said softly. "He needs his strength." "What's that?" I asked. "Vegetable broth," she replied, setting the bowl on the nightstand. "The doctor recommended light meals while he recovers." She stirred it slowly. "He eats this every day, twice a day." Then she glanced at me. "You're here now, Adeline. You can help take care of him." Downstairs, I could hear Nathan laughing during a phone call, already sounding comfortable in his new role, running the company, while I stayed upstairs, looking after the man who built it. The first few days almost felt normal. I helped Grandpa sit up, brought him water, and listened patiently while he tried to finish sentences that kept slipping away halfway through. Recovery after a stroke can look like that, clear moments followed by confusion. But after a while, something began to bother me. Patterns. Most mornings he seemed sharper. We could talk for a few minutes without trouble. One morning he looked at me and squinted. "Adeline, you still working overseas?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded slowly. "Good. Stay far away from your father's board meetings." Then he laughed, soft but genuine. But by evening, everything changed. My mother brought him dinner at almost the same time every night. A bowl of vegetable broth on a small tray. One night I stopped her in the hallway. "Mom." She turned. "What is it?" "That broth," I said. "You make it every day." "Of course. The doctor said light meals are easier for him." I hesitated. "Have you noticed something strange?" Her expression hardened slightly. "What do you mean about 10 minutes after he finishes eating? He gets confused again." She shrugged. "That's the stroke." "Every night?" I asked. Her voice cooled. "You're not a doctor." "Adeline." "No," I said quietly. "But I pay attention." She walked past me into Grandpa's room without answering. I stayed in the hallway. 10 minutes later, she came back carrying the empty bowl. "How is he?" I asked. "Sleeping." When I stepped inside, Grandpa was already drifting again, his breathing slow and heavy. And suddenly the pattern didn't feel like coincidence anymore. Downstairs, I heard Nathan laughing into his phone. "Yeah," he said loudly. "Whitaker Holdings is basically ours now." I stood beside the bed, staring at the empty tray. That was the moment the thought first crossed my mind. Something in this house wasn't right. Once the thought took hold, I couldn't ignore it. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. So, one evening, after my mother left the dinner tray in Grandpa's room, I made a quiet decision. While he slept, I poured a small portion of the broth into a sealed glass container and slipped it into my bag. The kitchen downstairs still smelled faintly of garlic and overcooked vegetables. I felt ridiculous the entire time, like a paranoid daughter inventing problems that didn't exist. The next morning, I drove into Boston and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Lena. There was a brief pause. Adeline Carter, she said. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Lena Ruiz had gone to medical school after college. She now worked in toxicology at a hospital lab. I need your opinion about something, I said. That usually means trouble, she replied lightly. I set the container on the small table in her office. It's from my grandfather's dinner, I explained. He's recovering from a stroke, but something about his symptoms doesn't add up. Lena studied the sample carefully. I can't run a full investigation, she said, but I can have the lab screen it for common medications. 2 days later, she called. You were right to question it, she said quietly. My stomach tightened. What did you find? A medication that suppresses memory and cognitive function, she replied. In repeated doses, it can also affect heart rhythm. For a moment, I couldn't speak, because suddenly the broth wasn't just suspicious, it was evidence. The night it happened, the house was unusually quiet. No phones ringing downstairs, no Nathan pacing through the halls talking about contracts. Just the steady hum of the oxygen machine beside Grandpa's bed. I must have dozed off in the chair, because the sound of his voice startled me awake. Adeline. It sounded stronger than usual. I leaned forward. I'm here. His eyes were open clearer than they had been in days. The kind of brief clarity doctors sometimes call a lucid window. They think I don't understand, he said quietly. My stomach tightened. Understand what your father and Nathan. He paused, catching his breath. Listen carefully. I took his hand. I'm listening. In my study, he said slowly. Second shelf, behind the atlas. There's a key to what a faint smile crossed his face. You were always impatient. I waited. It opens the safe, he murmured. Daniel knows about it. Daniel Mercer, the family lawyer. What's inside the safe? I asked. But the effort had already exhausted him. His grip loosened as his eyes began to close. Adeline, he whispered softly. Don't let them take everything. A moment later, the clarity faded again, and the room fell quiet. I sat there for a long time, replaying his words. A hidden key, a safe, and a lawyer who apparently knew far more about my grandfather's plans than anyone else in the house. 2 weeks later, my grandfather was gone. The funeral took place in a church in Beacon Hill. Old wood floors. The place smelled faintly like candle wax and rain-soaked coats. Boston's business crowd filled the pews. Investors, executives, people who had made their careers under Theodore Whitaker. My father stood near the front greeting everyone like a politician. Thank you for coming, Richard Carter kept saying. Nathan stayed close beside him. I swear the two of them looked almost relieved. At one point, Nathan leaned toward me. You holding up okay? He asked. Better than you think. He nodded toward the front rows. After today, the board's meeting again. He said quietly. We need stability. Stability. Funny word when you've been poisoning the company founder. The service ended quietly. Then Daniel Mercer stepped forward. Tall, gray suit, calm in that lawyer way that makes people listen. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, Theodore Whitaker left specific instructions regarding the reading of his will. My father stiffened. Nathan crossed his arms. Daniel opened a sealed folder. My estate shall be divided among my family, he began. A few people shifted in their seats. Then he kept reading. However, any beneficiary who attempts to manipulate my health, estate, or corporate authority for personal gain shall immediately forfeit their inheritance. The room went completely still. I could actually hear someone coughing in the back. Nathan leaned toward my father. What the hell is that supposed to mean? He whispered. My father didn't answer. Daniel looked up. And with that clause in mind, he said calmly, we must now review additional material provided to my office. That was my cue. I stood. Nathan frowned. "Adeline," he said under his breath. "What are you doing?" I walked past him toward the projector screen. My hands were steady. Strangely steady, because this moment had been building for weeks. "Tell me honestly, have you ever watched someone realize the game they thought they'd won was never theirs to begin with?" I connected the laptop to the projector near the front of the church. A pale light spread across the wall behind the altar. Conversations in the room faded as people turned toward the screen. Nathan stepped closer to me. "Adeline," he whispered sharply, "don't do this." I didn't answer. Daniel Mercer moved beside the podium. Theodore Whitaker left instructions that certain documents be presented to the board if questions ever arose about his health or the management of his estate. He said calmly. The first image appeared on the screen. A laboratory report. "This toxicology screening was conducted 3 days ago," Daniel continued. "The sample was taken from food regularly served to Mr. Whitaker during his recovery." A few people shifted in their seats. Nathan gave a short laugh, and Daniel didn't react. The analysis identified a medication that suppresses memory and cognitive function in repeated doses. It can also interfere with heart rhythm. The next image appeared. Security footage from the estate kitchen. The black and white video showed my mother at the counter, opening a small bottle and adding drops to a bowl before carrying it upstairs. A quiet murmur spread through the church. My father's voice rose above it. "This is absurd." Daniel spoke evenly. The footage came from the house security system and was preserved by the estate. The final slide showed a series of financial records. $2 million transferred from Whitaker Holdings into a private account controlled by Nathan. "That's temporary restructuring," Nathan said quickly. One of the board members stood. "No," he replied quietly. "That's unauthorized withdrawal." The silence that followed felt heavy. My mother finally spoke. "Adeline, you're misunderstanding." I looked at her. "For weeks," I said calmly, "you fed him that medication." My father stepped forward. "You're tearing this family apart." I looked around the room at the board members, investors, and people my grandfather had trusted for decades. "No." I said, "You already did." The fallout began before the church had even emptied. One of the Whitaker Holdings board members walked directly to Daniel Mercer. "We're placing Richard Carter on immediate suspension," he said. "Effective today." Nathan let out a short, nervous laugh. "You can't do that." The man barely looked at him. "We already have." My father turned toward me then, his voice low with anger. "You think you've won something here?" I met his eyes. "No," I said quietly. "Grandpa did. Within 2 weeks." The company opened a formal investigation. Nathan's private accounts were frozen while auditors reviewed the transfers. My mother stopped answering calls from anyone connected to the board. Whitaker Holdings continued without them. A few days later, Daniel met me outside the company headquarters. "The board would like you involved," he said. "In what role your grandfather left written instructions?" I shook my head. "I don't want the company." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's exactly why he trusted you." Instead, we followed another part of his plan, the Theodore Whitaker Foundation. It now funds medical research and small entrepreneurs who need a real opportunity. Months later, I stood in the lobby beneath my grandfather's portrait. People often expect stories like this to end with revenge, but what I felt wasn't revenge. It was something quieter. Sometimes the truth doesn't shout. It simply waits until the right moment to be heard.